Thank you for downloading the Broadmead Community Church Sermon Podcast. We hope you enjoy it.
So hopefully you've got a good feel now for some background to Jonah. And we felt that was really important before we kind of jump into what effectively is quite a short introduction to Jonah today. I find Jonah's reaction to God's request for him to go and speak to the Ninevites slightly perplexing. I don't know if you sit back and think about it, you agree with me or not? If I didn't know any of that background, particularly about the Assyrians, it seems quite impulsive. I mean, he physically got up and ran away from God. It's not exactly clear where Tarshish, the town that's mentioned, it's not exactly clear or fully agreed, I don't think, even among the scholars of the Bible, where exactly Tarshish was. Some people think it was in Lebanon. Some people think it was Sardinia, which is the far side of Italy. Some people think it was as far over as Spain. I think the general idea being really that it's not that important, but the general idea was that none of it was that way. Jonah was going that way. Okay, he was going the opposite way as far as he could get from where God had asked him to go. By physically running away, Jonah seemed to have completely forgotten who God is. Now, this is a bit odd in itself because Jonah was only one of 3 prophets that were alive in Israel at this time. There was only 3 of them. There was Jonah, there was Hosea, which is another book in the Bible, and there was Amos. Okay? Another book in the Bible. There wasn't very many of them. And given what we know of the Assyrians, as Susan and Max mentioned earlier, his reaction just indicates how crazy Jonah thought God's idea was, God's plan was, his request of him was. Was he scared? Or maybe he was jealous. Maybe he didn't want any other nations apart from Israel to have that special relationship that they had with God. Because the Assyrians were not part of Israel, God's chosen people. The Assyrians were actually Gentiles. And we learn a lot about the Gentiles in the New Testament of the Bible. And in the definition of Gentiles, we are Gentiles. So maybe Jonah was jealous and didn't want to share what he had that was special. I was trying to think of what the equivalent might be to today that would provoke the same reaction in me of physically running away. Perhaps if God had asked me to go and speak to a notorious Northampton gang, or perhaps a notorious group that's known around the world. There's a group in the news a few years ago called ISIS. Or perhaps it's going and speaking to a barbaric dictator and his army, massacring people, as some of you may have seen in the news recently in Myanmar. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about here. Okay, it's not a little conversation with your mate around the corner who you don't like very much. This isn't a big scale here. So hopefully that helps to appreciate maybe Jonah's reaction. He was getting as far out of here as he could. You and I are clearly not physically running away. Not today, at least. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be watching and sharing with us online. But does running away from God have to physically mean running away? Perhaps simply avoiding what God is asking you to do is pretty much the same thing. Maybe we're hiding from it, hoping that God will stop asking us if we hide for long enough. Stop asking us to be kind to someone that we really hate. Or stop asking us to go and speak to someone that we really don't want to speak to. A farmer once asked his neighbor if he might borrow some rope. "Sorry," said the neighbor, "I'm using the rope to tie up my milk." The farmer looked at him with a very quizzical expression. "Tie up your milk? You can't tie up milk with rope." "I know," replied the neighbor, "but when a man doesn't want to do something, one reason's as good as another." Let's not be pious here. Let's not be kind of overly religious about ourselves here. Hiding from God is a totally normal thing to do. Okay, I have hidden from God. I have run from God. Avoided Him doing what He's asking me to do. And I'm sure many of you can identify with that. It is quite normal, let me reassure you. Adam and Eve hid from God. They hid in their shame in the Garden of Eden. King David, one of Jesus' descendants in his family tree, he tried to hide from God when he'd sinned. With Jonah today, who we're thinking about, Peter ran away from God when he denied that he knew Jesus 3 times. He ran as far as he could. The parable of the prodigal son in the New Testament. The list goes on. I assure you, running and hiding from God is a totally normal reaction, and God is comfortable and at ease with us running and hiding from Him. And I really want you to grasp that today. He is at ease with yours and mine and what might seem like impulsive reactions. Maybe for some of us today, we are in a situation in our lives that God is asking us to do as Jesus asked us to do. And maybe we're delaying it, maybe we're avoiding it, maybe we're coming up with those reasons like tying our milk up with rope. Reasons why we shouldn't or couldn't possibly do that. Personally, I'm still waiting for the right moment to speak to my neighbor about Jesus. I'm waiting for the right moment to speak to my neighbor about Jesus. Or maybe it's not a situation that you're facing today. Maybe it's just about living as Jesus' followers. There are many commands that Jesus showed us and talked to us about in the New Testament. There are actually over 50 commands or 50 ways in which Jesus wants us to live as His followers. I encourage you to look them up in your own time. If you search on the internet for Jesus' commands, you'll get there quite quickly. Maybe you could dedicate a couple of months this year. Just take one a day and just read it, think about it, see if God is challenging you to live as a Jesus follower. And maybe we might realize that some of them we're trying to avoid, to be honest. Maybe it's time to confess that we all run from God. We're all trying to hide from God at times in one way or another. Maybe today it's time to repent of that. Stop running away and start running towards God.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check us out on all social media platforms or visit broadmead.org.uk.